Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the Spanish Civil War, one of the most overlooked but brutally revealing conflicts of the 20th century. Before a single shot was fired, Spain was already a country cracking under the weight of its contradictions. Imagine a nation caught in a tug-of-war between the past and the future, with each side pulling harder and angrier than the last. After World War I, while other European countries were busy licking their wounds or redrawing borders, Spain was facing something different: internal collapse. The monarchy, once seen as the bedrock of Spanish identity, fell in 1931. In its place, the Second Republic was born, promising reform, modernization, and a break from the old order. But instead of unity, this transition sparked chaos. You see, when you change the foundation of a society overnight, not everyone agrees on what should replace it. That brings us to the heart of Spain's fracture: deep societal divisions. Landowners were clinging to centuries of privilege, while landless peasants demanded redistribution. Devout Catholics clashed with secular reformers who wanted to push the church out of public life. And hovering above it all was the age-old struggle between monarchists and republicans, between those who wanted tradition and hierarchy, and those who wanted representation and change. It wasn't just politics. It was identity. It was belief. It was survival. Reformers tried to fix things, redistributing land, reshaping education, even challenging the church's grip. But instead of healing, these efforts triggered a backlash. Conservative elites weren't about to give up power without a fight. Picture the old guard barricading themselves behind centuries of tradition, now feeling cornered. And on the other side, the left was growing restless. Anarchists, socialists, and labor unions saw the republic as too slow, too cautious, too compromised. They didn't just want reforms, they wanted revolution. And in their eyes, the Republic's moderate agenda was just another version of the same old oppression. So what do you get when you mix collapsing institutions, radical ideologies, and a population split down the middle? You get a powder keg. And by the mid-1930s, the fuse was already lit. Now that we've set the stage, let's look at what actually ignited the Spanish Civil War. By 1936, tensions boiled over with the victory of the Popular Front, a leftist coalition of Republicans, socialists, and communists. Their win at the polls was more than just a political shift. For many on the right, it felt like the country had been hijacked by radicals. Conservatives, monarchists, and fascist sympathizers saw this as a direct threat, not just to their political values, but to their way of life. And they didn't just grumble about it in newspapers. Behind the scenes, they began plotting. That's where military coup planning came in. General Franco, along with a group of high-ranking officers, began coordinating a rebellion. Their goal? To reassert traditional authority. But let's not sugarcoat it. They weren't just defending old values. They were preparing to crush democratic rule through military force. Now, picture the country at this moment. You've got two sides building armies, not metaphorically, but literally. The Republic, still clinging to legal governance, was backed by workers' militias, communists, and anarchists. Meanwhile, Franco's faction was rallying support from monarchists, the Catholic Church, and the rising Falangist movement, Spain's answer to fascism. These were polarized support bases, and there was no middle ground left to stand on. And so, Spain became an ideological battleground. Fascism, socialism, liberal democracy, anarchism. It wasn't just a civil war anymore, it was a philosophical war for the soul of a nation. Ideas weren't debated in parliament, they were fought over in the streets, in the fields, and eventually, across front lines. The fragile republic hadn't just met resistance, it had met a full-scale reaction. And as history shows us, when a republic faces a coup backed by ideology and force, the question isn't whether a war will come, it's when. By now, Spain was on fire, but the smoke drew attention from far beyond its borders. You see, the Spanish Civil War didn't just stay Spanish, it became a global proxy war, a rehearsal for something even darker just around the corner: World War II. Let's start with the Axis powers. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy didn't just send telegrams of support, they sent tanks, planes, and troops. Franco's nationalist forces suddenly had access to cutting-edge weaponry and military expertise. For Hitler and Mussolini, Spain was the perfect testing ground, a laboratory for fascism, where they could refine their tactics and gauge how the world might react. Spoiler alert: the world didn't do much. On the other side, the Republicans looked to the Soviet Union. Stalin sent arms, aircraft, and military advisors, but this help came with strings. While aiding the fight against Franco, Soviet agents also worked to suppress the anarchist and Trotskyist factions within the Republican side. So even as bombs fell, there were power struggles within the so-called allies of the Republic. It was support, yes, but with internal sabotage baked in. Now, you might expect Western democracies to step in. France, Britain, even the United States. But instead, they declared neutrality through something called the Non-Intervention Pact. Sounds responsible, right? In reality, it paralyzed aid to the Republic and left Franco's enemies more isolated than ever. While fascists armed one side and communists selectively aided the other, Western powers stood back, hands clean, but consciences stained. Yet not everyone stayed on the sidelines. Enter the International Brigades, a remarkable movement of over 35,000 foreign volunteers. These were everyday people, students, poets, veterans, who traveled to Spain to defend the Republic, seeing it as the front line against fascism. It was solidarity at its most courageous and its most tragic. So what we had in Spain wasn't just a civil war anymore. It was a dress rehearsal for global catastrophe, a clash of ideologies that previewed the horror to come. And the world? It watched, tested weapons, made speeches, and waited. Let's shift gears now and talk economics, because war isn't just fought with guns and bombs. It's also fought with policies, production, and control over who gets what. During the Spanish Civil War, both sides didn't just clash militarily, they pursued radically different economic systems, and both paid a heavy price. In the Republican zones, particularly in places like Catalonia, there was a wave of collectivization. Under strong anarchist influence, factories, farms, and even public services were turned into worker-run cooperatives. The idea was bold: eliminate hierarchy, distribute resources based on need, and let voluntary associations guide the economy. It was revolutionary and chaotic. Coordination suffered. Supplies ran short. Ideology often outpaced practicality. Meanwhile, in nationalist-controlled areas, Franco moved in the opposite direction. He re-centralized the economy, restoring land and property rights to the old elites. The church regained influence, and traditional hierarchies were reinforced. On the surface, this looked more orderly, but it was hardly free. It served the powerful, not the people. And as the war dragged on, inflation and famine ravaged both sides. Currency devalued, trade routes collapsed, cities starved, fields went untended. In some places, food became a weapon rationed to supporters, withheld from dissenters. The economy wasn't just broken, it was weaponized. Even worse, distorted incentives emerged across the board. Centralized authorities, on both the left and the right, micromanaged production and distribution. But without prices to guide resources, or profit to drive innovation, local producers had little motivation to work efficiently. Shortages grew, black markets thrived, people began hoarding or fleeing. And so, instead of lifting Spain out of crisis, both economic systems, collectivist and authoritarian, accelerated the collapse. It's a haunting reminder, even in the name of justice or order, when local agency is replaced by central control, the unintended consequences are often hunger, inefficiency, and desperation. By early 1939, the war was nearing its brutal conclusion, and the momentum had clearly shifted. The nationalist forces, under Franco's command, were advancing steadily. Why? One major reason was superior support. Germany and Italy kept the flow of weapons, vehicles, and soldiers going. For Franco, it was like having a full foreign military-industrial complex behind him. The Republic? It was running on fumes and internal fractures. Those internal fractures would prove fatal. Inside the Republic, fragmentation was tearing the coalition apart. Anarchists and communists, once united in fighting Franco, were now turning on each other. Strategic coordination broke down. Resources were mismanaged. Command structures collapsed. It wasn't just a war against an enemy, it became a war within. And then came the key victories. Barcelona, once a stronghold of anarchist revolution, fell in January of 1939. The fall of Madrid followed soon after. With those cities lost, the Republic had no ground left to stand on. Franco officially declared victory. But the fighting, in many ways, was just beginning, because what followed wasn't peace. It was punishment. Franco launched a brutal purge of anyone associated with the Republic. Over 200,000 people were executed, imprisoned, or disappeared in the years that followed. Teachers, journalists, union organizers, politicians, anyone who had dared to dream of a different Spain. Their lives were swept away in what Franco called reunification. But history remembers it as something darker, repression by design. And so, through superior firepower, foreign aid, and a divided enemy, Franco didn't just win a war. He seized a country and silenced its soul. So Franco had won. But what kind of Spain emerged from the ashes? Let's be clear, Franco's victory didn't just mark the end of a war. It marked the beginning of a 4-decade dictatorship. One-man rule, no elections, no dissent, no press freedom. Spain became a laboratory for centralized authoritarian control, where every lever of power, from the economy to education, was pulled from the top down. And the consequences were profound. First, there was the economic fallout. Under Franco, Spain turned inward. Foreign trade was restricted. Price controls and state monopolies dominated key industries. The result? Economic stagnation. Innovation dried up. Productivity lagged behind the rest of Europe. Spain, once a proud empire, was now a closed system, struggling to feed itself. Then there were the cultural and political costs. Freedom of speech? Gone. Independent unions? Outlawed. Regional languages like Catalan and Basque? Banned from schools, newspapers, and public life. Franco's Spain wasn't just centralized, it was homogenized by force. And yet, there's a strange twist. Despite the brutality, Franco remained in power until his death in 1975. Why? In part because the Cold War changed global priorities. As long as Franco was anti-communist, many Western powers, especially the United States, were willing to look the other way. It's a chilling example of how geopolitical convenience can outweigh moral clarity. So yes, centralized control triumphed in Spain. But at what cost? A vibrant republic was crushed, individual freedoms were extinguished, and for nearly 40 years, an entire nation lived under the weight of silence. Now let's step back, not just to review the facts, but to wrestle with the bigger picture. Because the Spanish Civil War wasn't just a conflict over borders or leaders. It was a struggle over systems, agency, and consequences, the kind that echo far beyond the battlefield. First, there's the lesson of foreign intervention. Spain became a proving ground for global powers to test weapons, strategies, and ideologies. But it also revealed something darker, that when powerful nations use smaller ones as pawns, the human cost is enormous. Spain didn't ask to be a proxy war, it became one. And it paid the price in blood, rubble, and memory. Then there's the failure of decentralization, not because decentralization itself is flawed, but because it wasn't allowed to function. On the Republican side, too many competing ideologies, anarchists, communists, socialists, couldn't coordinate. Their vision of a freer society was undermined by internal power struggles, many stoked by Soviet interference. Local agency was promised, but it was never fully protected. And that brings us to individual agency. The tragedy of the Spanish Civil War is how quickly the dreams of millions were swallowed up by the machinery of ideology. Farmers, workers, teachers, these weren't just statistics. They were people trying to build something better, only to find themselves crushed between two extremes. The systems they trusted, whether centralized or revolutionary, often failed to serve them, or worse, used them. So what if Spain had been left to find its own path? What if foreign powers hadn't hijacked the conflict for their own ends? What if the Republic had been supported, not just with words, but with the kind of aid that might have preserved it? History doesn't offer answers, but it does leave us with questions that matter. Because the next time a society stands at the edge, torn between competing visions of control and freedom, what will we learn from Spain, or will we forget? The Spanish Civil War ended over 80 years ago, but its echoes haven't faded, they've just grown quieter. Today, it's a conflict that many gloss over. It's rarely covered in textbooks. Few politicians reference it, and even fewer draw lessons from it. But maybe that's the greatest warning of all. Because this war wasn't just a local tragedy. It was a global preview. A democratic republic was torn apart not only by its own contradictions, but by the opportunism of greater powers. It was a battlefield where ideology overran identity, where polarization replaced politics, and force replaced compromise. And the warning signs? They're not locked in the past. They're everywhere. In rising political extremism, in economic instability, in the erosion of free speech and dissent. Spain's descent didn't happen all at once. It happened in steps, each justified by fear, each defended as necessary. And by the time people looked up, the Republic was gone. History isn't just about what happened, it's about what could happen again. So if you've made it this far, here's what I'd ask: don't let the Spanish Civil War remain a footnote. Let it be a mirror, a question, a challenge. And if you enjoyed this dive into one of history's forgotten warnings, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. It helps us keep exploring the stories they tried to bury, and the truths they tried to erase. And if you want to go even deeper, check out my book History They Tried to Erase, the link's in the description. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never stop asking, what else have we been told to forget?